Chapter 4. Trust. After the photograph fiasco, Mike began to open up a little more. Was it my willingness to accept his explanation about the stolen photos? Or the fact that I was willing to listen to him regardless of whether he produced evidence or not? I didn't know. He still seemed to need to share his story with someone, and I was determined simply to be a soundboard for him. I had come to enjoy his wit, the strange dichotomy of coarse language and intelligence, and his sometimes wicked brand of humor that would catch me off guard and often cause me to burst into laughter. I realized that our relationship was moving from that of a witness and researcher into the realm of genuine friendship. I liked Mike. His personality was complex and multifaceted. On one hand, he came off as a rather gruff, distrusting, no-nonsense guy who didn't put up for 1 second with anything that he considered bullshit. He was prickly at times, quietly reserved at others. He thought things through before he said them, sometimes stopping in mid-sentence to digress and instead explain in detailed metaphor. It often felt like his trust was on the end of a short rope that he would yank back if he had the slightest indication that I was going to betray him, and I found myself treading delicately. But there was another side to Mike as well, a deeper part that I caught glimpses of through the cracks in his deliberately rough defenses. An inherent quality that he appeared determined to hide. A big grin split my face the moment I realized it. Underneath it all, Mike was a big softy. This became even more apparent when Mike began telling me about his experiences in detail. When someone relates an encounter to me verbally, I usually ask him or her to fill out a sighting questionnaire. When the witness puts the sighting into written format, it ensures that all of the details and pertinent information is retained accurately for posterity. But I was beginning to get the impression that Mike's experiences were so far beyond most witnesses' solitary, incidental sightings that the format of a sighting questionnaire would be useless. I hadn't even bothered to take notes in the beginning, since he didn't want me to share the information anyway. And at this point, I was so far behind, I felt that if I attempted to write down the things he'd told me, I'd never catch up. During one of our now regular Saturday phone calls, I asked him tentatively, "How would you feel about writing down your experiences?" He expressed reluctance, more about the writing than the sharing.
I don't talk right. People are always making fun of the way I talk. I don't write no better.
"The way you speak has nothing to do with what you say," I told him gently. Mike was exceptionally astute, and his particular dialect, as it were, had no bearing on that. To my Northwest-grown ears, his distinctive drawl was rather endearing. Nevertheless, I didn't press the issue. Several days later, Mike sent me an email. He'd created a private document online that only he and I had access to, and sent me the link. Like most witnesses, Mike hadn't begun to talk about his experiences until long after they had begun. However, unlike many long-term witnesses I'd worked with, Mike seemed very reluctant to interpret anything, which was one of the things that made him so credible from day one. I was used to dealing with witnesses who had struggled to make sense of their encounters and would inevitably end up interpreting their limited observations through whatever belief system or understanding of the world they held. By the time they related their story to me, they had usually woven elaborate explanations for what had occurred. At that point, it was up to me, as a researcher, to separate the wheat from the chaff, the facts from the interpretation. Mike just told what he saw, what he smelled, what he heard, both on the phone and now in this document. As I started to read, I was floored. I had expected a few brief notes about his experiences. Instead, what I discovered when I opened the document was pages upon pages of single-spaced type, detailed interactions from day one, commentary on the creature's behavior and eating habits, and his occasional thoughts on why the creature might have behaved the way he did. He had touched on many of these events in our talks, but even then, I had no idea of the extent of Mike's interactions or his knowledge of the swamp and these creatures in it. It seemed that despite his persistent distrust for me because of my status as a researcher, Mike was somewhat relieved to be unburdening himself of his secret. I devoured the text in one sitting, my eyes glued to the screen. Suddenly, so many of the questions that had plagued me during a lifetime of wondering and analyzing were being addressed, one by one, in the small and stunning details of Mike's unique interactions with this creature. I was happy to see that he had started at the very beginning.
It was the summer of 1998. I was walking up a sandbar far up a river in Florida where I live. I looked down and saw the biggest footprints I ever saw. They were at least 16 inches long and 7 inches wide, and they were about 3 inches deep. I followed them along the riverbank until they disappeared into the woods. The place is 15 miles from the nearest town, and you can only get there by boat. Off the main river, there's a small creek that goes deep into the swamp, and the trees don't let in much sunlight, so it's dark even in the daytime. The swamp is thousands of acres surrounded by woods and planted pines. All total, there's millions of acres of wild land to roam. With the few people at the end of this creek, I have a camp, the only high ground in this part of the swamp. The ground is covered with knee-high ferns and is soft and wet with a strong smell of rotting leaves. The canopy overhead is so thick that it makes you feel like you're inside a building. At night, it gets so dark that without a light, you might as well be walking around with your eyes closed. After I saw the footprints, I wanted to see what made them. I started to go back there as much as I could, hoping to get a look at what I knew was a skunk ape. I'd spend all day and night walking and wading around the swamp looking for them. At night, I could hear them scream. It'd make the hair stand up on the back of my neck. It was a lonely scream, almost a cry, and I'd call back, my voice echoing through the swamp. It'd be quiet for a while, and then he'd scream again. I'd always call back to let him know he wasn't alone. I felt sad for him. It was the saddest thing I ever heard, and I knew how he felt. I didn't like people much and chose to spend most of my time alone. Even as a kid, I never felt like I belonged and was always on the outside looking in. That lonely cry in the night touched me deep inside. I wanted to reach out to him. I felt drawn to him. It was like he was calling to me. As time went on, I'd see quick glimpses of him, a shadow moving in the swamp, always keeping his distance. I'd move toward him, trying to get a closer look, but he'd always vanish as I got nearer. I needed to bring him to me, but how? What kind of bait would I use? What would make him want to come to me? At first, I'd leave fruit out in the swamp, but he never found it. I thought he couldn't smell it, so I got some scented candles and would light them, thinking he'd smell them and come to see what it was and find the fruit I'd left for him. But it didn't work. I tried everything. If it smelled, I tried it. Then, one day, I saw incense in the store and thought, these things really have a smell. So I bought a handful of cinnamon ones and headed back to the swamp. I walked around, found out where he was, and moved around so I was upwind from him. I took the whole bunch, wrapped a rubber band around them, and lit them all at once, putting them on a stump. I put a bag of overripe peaches on the ground and moved 90 degrees to one side so he couldn't smell me. I walked about 100 yards out, lay down behind the deadfall, and waited for him to come. In a little while, through my field glasses, I saw him coming, moving slowly through the trees, stopping to test the air and to look around. They're very smart. They know when something's not right, and he wasn't taking any chances. He slowly walked up to the stump, picked up the incense, smelled it, and then put it in his mouth as if to taste it. I think it burned him because he threw it down and stepped back and looked around. It seemed like he knew I was around, but wasn't sure where I was. He bent down, picked up the bag of peaches, and started to eat, looking around to see where I was. After he got done eating, I stood up and yelled, "My name is Mike, and I want to be your friend." I had taken off my ghillie suit. I wanted him to see who was talking to him. He froze and stared at me, and I turned and walked away, not looking back. I wanted him to know that I wasn't going to hurt him and that the next move was his to make.
Somehow, Mike had sensed something that seems imperative in gaining the trust of the Bigfoot. He understood that he needed to allow him to remain in control. I had learned this same bit of crucial information many years ago from a long-term witness in Northern California. This witness, whom I'll call Michelle, contacted me via email about her habituation. She had been recovering from an illness and was loaned a house by a musician friend of hers who was often on the road. She moved into the small dome-shaped home in the woods and wasn't aware that there was anything strange going on until she was lying out sunbathing in the nude one afternoon. There wasn't supposed to be anyone around, so when she heard a noise, turned, and saw a big, hairy thing staring at her, she was understandably shaken. Her encounters around her home with what she also called the big guys continued for almost 10 years before I met her. She and I spent nearly 2 years corresponding before we finally set a date to meet at her house. It took that long for us to fully develop friendship and trust. And by the time she finally invited me down, I felt justified in spending the time and money on the trip. She had moved a few miles down the road from the friend's borrowed cabin, but still had access to the property. These are excerpts from my journal during that trip. On May 26th, 2000, my partner Bob and I arrived late, about 11 p.m. We set up the tent in the meadow in front of the new house, and Bob laid down, tired from the long drive. Michelle and I sat on a stump there in the meadow, listening to the night sounds. We heard many strange sounds that night. A high-pitched whistling scream in the distance, intermixed with dogs or coyotes barking, a loud screech like an indrawn breath, a lower-pitched low, low sound that, eerily, was more said than sung, and several roosters crowing back and forth in the darkness between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, one of which coughed while crowing. About an hour later, as I lay in the tent, something big ran by and threw an empty 55-gallon trash can up against the side of the house. The following night, Michelle asked if we'd like to go to the old place and go for a hike. Bob was nervous and reluctant because it was dark, about 11 p.m., but he agreed. I was nervous, too, about going in the dark, especially when Michelle explained that we'd be hiking deep into the woods and that the other researcher who was visiting refused to come. But I was excited, too. What an adventure! The neighbors living in the dome house weren't home. They had 4 large dogs running loose that we had to contend with, that barked and growled, but stopped at the gate as we walked the road into the woods. They refused to follow us any further. We followed Michelle about a half-mile or more back into the canyon on a single-track trail, over logs and through blackberry bushes, over two small creeks, until we reached the big rock where she feeds her big guys. After flicking about 7 ticks off my pants, we settled down on top of the rock and she began to call them. I was nervous and excited. I kept shaking involuntarily despite my best efforts to stay calm. We sat there for about half an hour, and soon I began hearing what I can only describe as stealthy noises coming from 2 areas in front of us. It sounded as if someone were sneaking up on us. I could hear quiet and slow but distinct bipedal footsteps coming towards us from ahead and slightly to the right, and I began to hear something shuffling around to our left about 20 feet out. For the next few minutes, we sat and listened, hearing shuffling sounds and things moving about quietly. I concentrated on just trying not to shake, and Michelle held my hand to calm me down. She also had me pet Bob's head, to groom him, she said. Seeing me do so would relax them. Once or twice, we heard whistles from down in the hollow or back up on the ridge. Finally, Michelle took the banana I'd brought, broke it into pieces, threw it out in front of the rock, and said we should head back up the canyon. "We're leaving?" I asked.
"We have to allow them to remain in control,"
she said. She explained that they would come get the food if they wanted it, and would follow us out. Bob muttered something to the effect of, "Oh, great," and I grinned. His nerves were shot. Mine weren't much better, but I wasn't ready to quit yet. We hiked about halfway back down the trail until Michelle suddenly said,
"Okay, this is good,"
and arranged the blanket in the middle of the path. We all sat down on it. She said it would take about 10 minutes for them to come, and sure enough, about 10 minutes later, we heard those same crunching footsteps pass by on either side of us. It was a deeply vulnerable feeling to be sitting down in the dark, in the presence of what sounded like several huge somethings tromping around. But I understood now that this was the whole point. To submit, to trust, and to give in to the experience. We heard others coming. Every now and then there were whistles near the footsteps, quiet, discreet sounds, an almost, "Hey," kind of whistle, of short duration, low to high-pitched, and subtle, no louder than a bird. One of them passed us by completely and headed up the trail behind us. A minute or two later, it broke a branch that sounded about as big as my femur. It made a big crack sound and stomped around a bit. Michelle whispered,
"I think it's doing that for Bob's benefit, letting him know who's boss."
I don't think Bob was of a mind to argue. At one point during all of this, I had to pee, and I simply couldn't hold it anymore. It happens when I get nervous. I walked a few short feet away from the blanket and squatted next to a tree in the pitch blackness, all the while wondering if something was going to snatch me up and whisk me away with my pants around my ankles. I also worried about ticks and mosquitoes biting my behind. I'm a worrier, I guess. I managed to brave all the bugs and the big guys and sat down on the blanket, finally able to concentrate again. And that's when things got really interesting. I don't know if my nature show had something to do with it, but once I sat back down, our forest visitors began to move around in earnest. I heard shuffling around us in all directions, and suddenly Bob said that he saw a figure walk by on the small ridge to our left. It blotted out part of the dimly lit sky for a moment. I turned to look as he whispered,
"Look up there. Something just walked between those trees."
By the time I looked, it had moved on. Moments later, I felt prickly. The hair stood up on my neck, and I heard stepping. a settling, and a strange creaking sound very close to my left side, which faced the woods. It sounded the way my knee joint creak sometimes when I crouch down. Then, suddenly, I smelled it, as if someone had opened a sewer line. There were 3 separate, distinct whiffs, or puffs, of odor. It carried to my nose like cigarette smoke does. Strong and eye-watering, I whispered to Michelle. I think one is right here behind the bush to my left. I reached my hand out as I asked, "What happens if I reach out to it?" She answered back,
Don't be surprised if he touches you.
I jerked my hand back. I wasn't ready for that. I wanted to do something to interact with this thing I couldn't see. I turned and smiled gently in the direction of the bush, and the fear shut off as if someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, I simply wasn't afraid anymore. I heard rustling as whatever it was moved back up the hill. I sat there, filled with peace and awe and amazement as the sounds around us continued. The one on the trail ahead of us, ahead and to the left, whistled several times, and the only one directly to the right rustled the leaves and moved around a lot. Then things became quieter. Bob was complaining that his stomach was hurting due to nerves, bad food, or both, and we decided to leave. As we hiked out, I could hear at least one of them walking parallel to us, whistling intermittently. It stopped at the bottom of the road, near the incline that would take us to the house. Strangely, the dogs had stopped at the top, almost as if there were a barrier of several yards that neither would cross. I think the thing that struck me the most was how quiet, stealthy, and discreet Michelle's big guys were. When I see researchers running around wearing camouflage and talking about tracking them and trying to beat them at their own game on their turf, I just laugh. Trust. It would become a central theme in my journey to understanding these creatures, as well as those who interact with them.